This is Professor Davis. This is your topics checklist for Module 5 for Math 1650 College Algebra Online. Well, in this module, we really kind of begin the essence of college algebra and introduce functions and their properties and the basics of how they work. In section 3.1, we start out and define the function, and what we want to be able to do to glean from that section is to be able to evaluate a function, and you'll see a nice table on evaluating functions there in that section, and also in example 5. Now, by evaluating a function, we mean to plug a number in for x and get a value for f of x. That's all we mean by evaluating a function. So by evaluating, we mean find specific values of f of x if we know what x is. And also in terms of defining what a function is, we want to be able to use the vertical line test as shown in example 6. There's a pointwise argument on whether a relation is a function or not, you'll see in there. And then there's this graphical test called the vertical line test we can use as well. And then I guess the one of the primary things we want to be able to do in this section is to be able to write the domain of a function using interval notation. Functions' domains are the set of values that we can plug in for x, so to speak. So you want to make sure you look over that, and you might want to review over interval notation so you remember how to do that. So in that section, we want to practice problems 1 through 41 odd, and that starts on page 100 if you have the summary notebook, or in the ebook that would be on ebook screen 3.1-36. Now in section 3.2, that's where we really learn many of the properties of a function's graph. So in example 2 there, you'll see a nice explanation on how we can inspect a graph of a function, and from that to help determine what the domain and range of that function is. So, and that reminds me, we also want to talk about graphing functions, and so this is where you're really, in this chapter, where you really want to start to take advantage of the usefulness of your graphing calculator. So at the end of this mathcast, I'll show you some tips that you can use to get started, and I'll also be offering up some of my own videos on that later on. So we want to be able to look at a graph, write the domain and range of a function, and then write the intervals where a function is increasing, in other words, simply going uphill from left to right, so to speak, where it is decreasing, and where it is constant, meaning where it is level, so to speak, where it's horizontal. And there's a good explanation of that in example 4. And then in example 5, they introduce the idea of the relative minimum and the relative maximum points of a function. And again, that's where we can really use our graphing calculator to help us. So make sure you look over that. And there's also some algebraic ways we can find these relative minimums and maximums, in particular for quadratic functions. And then we want to look at a function and determine whether it's odd, even, or neither. And that has to do with the notion of symmetry. So make sure you look over those examples. That's in example 7. And then finally, putting all that together, there's a nice example in example 8 there, and some corresponding exercises on interpreting the graph of a function. So in that section, in section 3.2, we want to do exercises 1 through 31 odd. That starts on page 111 in the summary notebook, and ebook screen 3.2-28. Now, finally, to finish off of the module here for module 5, in section 3.3, we have the graphs of basic functions and piecewise functions. And there's not, really, this is primarily a reading section with one skill. First, you want to make sure you read over the 9 basic functions: the identity function, the constant function, the square root function, the absolute value function, the exponential function, etc. And because that forms the basis of one of the topics we'll look at later, called transformations. So make sure you read over the information on the 9 basic functions. And then I guess the challenging part of this section is graphing piecewise defined functions. And again, like I said before, I'll offer up a video that will help you on graphing piecewise defined functions using your graphing calculator, so you can kind of sketch them by hand and then check your work using that graphing calculator. And there's also an application of the piecewise defined function that's pretty neat in example 4, so make sure you look over that. So in section 3.3 we want to do practice exercises 1 through 17 odd. That's on ebook screen 3.3-22, they start there, or page 135 if you've got the summary notebook. Now, one other thing I wanted to talk about was how we can get some information on graphing calculators to start out. This might be the first class where you ever had to use one, so let me show you how to do that. And that is in the area that's called Tools for Success. So that's the button near the bottom here, Tools for Success. And there, the second link you'll see is for the graphing calculator tutorial. So let's open that up and take a quick look at it. And this is first broken down into general topics, whether they be from graphing, where we take a graphical look at college algebra, making a table where we take a look at the numerical aspects of college algebra, and also there's also some topics that we won't talk about, whether they be statistics, probability, or trigonometry. We want to go to the tab that says Graphing. That's a good place to start. And you can look over these problems where they talk about setting the viewing window. And I guess the one you might want to start with is the one right here that says Graphing a quadratic function. So I'll show you how it works. So what we do is, notice here we have a graphing calculator on the left side, and notice that this key right here in the upper left corner is highlighted. It's kind of strobing on and off. That means you punch that key, and that corresponds to what's going on here in step 1 in the right side. So here we're graphing this quadratic function that has a rational quadratic coefficient. So we start out and we go ahead and touch that y equals key, and that will get up the function screen where we can enter a function. And then notice the left parenthesis key is highlighted, so we can just tap on that. And then notice we can just continue in the same fashion and go ahead and enter the function that they have here in their example. And so once we have that in, so notice now we're down at step 3, and we've entered our function now in y1, and we're going to go ahead and use the zoom key, and that gives us our various kind of viewing windows we could start at. And notice here they always talk about, if you're not sure where to start at the standard viewing window, and that's where we have -10 and 10 for the left and right side of the screen, and -10 and 10 for the bottom and top on the y-axis of the screen. So there you see the graph of that function we just had. And then you can look later on, you can look in the index and see how you can do various other graphs. Like I said before, make numeric tables. And also, as a matter of fact, there's one here on graphing piecewise defined functions. And so maybe I wouldn't have to make my own video on that. Send me an email if you'd like me to. But here's one where they go through the steps of what's called concatenation. That's where we blend two parts of a function together, and so we can make our piecewise defined functions that way. So there's our topics checklist for Module 5.